Welcome everybody to the Washington Naval Treaty 100th anniversary presentation with Mark McDonagh, and we're going to convert to Mark right now.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark McDonagh. I'm with the National Security Decision Making Game Staff. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain, 10 years active and 20 reserves. I spent about 12 years on the campus in Newport, Rhode Island, between the Navy Warfare Development Command and the Naval War College. I'm here today to discuss the Washington Naval Treaty and about the 100th anniversary, we're a little bit past that, a few months past that now, that 1921 and 22 negotiated to avoid a naval arms race, and sort of did that, but primarily also shaped the nature of the force that would start World War II. So let's begin then. If it will move for me. Okay, the Washington Naval Treaty is also known as the Five Power Treaty. It was negotiated by the major allies in World War I, which were Great Britain, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan. Of course, a lot more nations fought on the Allied side in World War I, but these are considered the great powers. A lot of our discussions and thinking and expectations about what World War I was and what happened are colored by our trying to view World War I through the filter of World War II. We have to remember in World War I, Italy and Japan were both allies and both fought with the allies in World War I. Germany in 1921, Germany had been a defeated nation, was harshly limited by the Treaty of Versailles, and German naval threat was non-existent. Germany wasn't invited to the Washington Naval Treaty. Germany was, in fact, still restricted by Versailles in what type of navy she could build, specifically none. The goal of the Washington Naval Treaty is to try to prevent a naval arms race by limiting naval construction. It was held in Washington, D.C. between November 1921 and February 1922. Let me go over some of the terminology I'll be using, because there are different senses to the use of some of these words. I want to make sure that we're all understanding what I mean when I use the words in this lecture. A battleship, for example, in this presentation, when I use the word battleship or BB, it refers to a dreadnought or a dreadnought battleship. The British prefer the term dreadnoughts, and the U.S. dreadnought battleships. Anything that's a pre-dreadnought battleship, which generally went obsolete in 1904, 1905, I'll call out explicitly as a pre-dreadnought battleship. A battle cruiser is similar in armament to the corresponding battleship design, but it's often larger, and it trades off armor for about 10 knots of speed advantage over the battleship. Battle cruisers were introduced as a means of generally hunting down armed raiding cruisers and their other long-range power projection niches. The designs for battle cruisers fell short catastrophically at the Battle of Jutland, when the British attempted to put battle cruisers in the battle line themselves, and 3 exploded during the battle. A fast battleship was just being developed in 1921, supposedly. The Japanese had the Ki design of what they called a fast battleship, and it corresponds to the battleship of the time, only about has a 6-knot speed margin, usually by making the ship larger and putting on more propulsion. Japan, in theory, had the first, but in my opinion, Hood was actually the first real fast battleship. And in my opinion, the fast battleship can be argued as the ultimate incarnation of the battle cruiser, which was generally considered to be obsolete after 1916, 1917. The term capital ship I use in this presentation as an overarching term for all of the above: battleships, battle cruisers, and fast battleships. More lexicon. Cruiser at the time is different from our cruiser expectations from today, or even from World War II. The term cruiser was applied to any long-range open ocean warship. They were smaller, cheaper, and easier to maintain than capital ships, able to cruise long distances. Specific uses included scout cruisers, armored cruisers, light armored cruisers, which became abbreviated to light cruiser, and that term became used throughout World War II. They were designed to very different objectives, and as a result had very different characteristics. These distinctions became blurred substantially by design strictures that came out of the Washington Naval Treaty. The cruiser ended up being more restricted in terms of what it was supposed to do. The generic term cruiser was applied to a whole lot of different things that had a whole lot of different purposes. The term destroyer in 1921 had been shortened previously from torpedo boat destroyer. It was a small specialized warship that was designed to protect the battle line of capital ships from torpedo boats and to deliver their own torpedo attacks themselves. They're not cruisers in range, endurance, or sea-keeping ability. If, for example, today you wanted to get on a destroyer in Norfolk and somebody tells you to sail to Rota, Spain, nobody have a problem thinking that that ship could do it. But in 1921, a destroyer would have to think about going to Halifax and refueling, going to Keflavik and refueling, going to Portsmouth and refueling, and then going on to Rota. So these destroyers were smaller, more specialized. A torpedo boat was a small, fast, short-range boat designed usually to make in-mass attacks on capital ships. The torpedo and the power torpedo and the torpedo boats revolutionized naval warfare in the late 19th century. At this point, they're becoming obsolete because, except for very short-range coastal work, but in terms of a battle line, they didn't have the sea-keeping capability that was becoming necessary. A submarine. I submit that the definition of a submarine is obvious. But I bring it up here to mention that the British in 1921 still remembered the pain from the World War I German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, and they largely hated submarines in 1921 when the conference started. I want to briefly mention tonnage. When I refer to tons, the tonnage of a ship, I'm usually referring to long tons. There's short tons, long tons, and metric tons. A short ton is conventionally 20 hundredweight. And a U.S. hundredweight is 100 pounds, so a short ton is the classical definition of a ton as being 2,000 pounds. A long ton, also known as an imperial ton or a displacement ton, it's also a hundredweight, but a British hundredweight is 8 stones or 14 pounds. That makes a long ton 2,240 pounds. Traditionally, in naval design, long tons was when someone referred to tonnage, it was long tons they were talking about, and we will be in this lecture as well. Today, a metric ton is more common in naval design, and the metric ton is written down usually as TONNE, and that's 1,000 kilograms, which is 2,204 pounds, fairly close to a displacement ton. There are two different definitions of displacement. The one typically going into the conference was being used was the normal displacement, what a ship displaced in terms of with quote all outfit, 2/3 supply of stores, ammunition, etc. on board, and that's a U.S. Naval Institute definition dating back to 1897, which was still in effect at this time. Standard displacement, also known as Washington displacement, as a result of the conference, was a specific term defined by the Washington Naval Treaty of the ship, complete, fully manned, ready for sea, including ammunition, equipment, provisions, and fresh water, miscellaneous stores. But differing from normal displacement, did not include fuel, did not include reserve boiler feed water. The British insisted a new definition be applied because the British felt that they had more of a need for long-range operations and more of a need for ships with a lot of fuel capacity and reserve boiler feed water. And it would have been unfair to apply one standard of tonnage that didn't give the British that allowance. Now let's discuss where the different nations, the 5 nations, were at the starting point of the Washington Naval Treaty. The United States was in the best position at the start of negotiations. We had the economic and industrial strength to compete in a naval arms race. We'd only fought World War I for a little over a year and a half, so compared to everyone else, we had very low debt. We were able to crush any competitor in the naval arms race. That put us in the catbird seat, so to speak. We saw a competition with Japan for Far East dominance as being our next major geostrategic issue to come up. There was an Anglo-Japanese alliance. The British were allied with Japan at the time, and that would be a complication in terms of the enemy, my friend is my enemy, was going to get awkward. And that was a geostrategic consideration for the United States also to see if we can somehow scuttle that alliance. We had started an ambitious naval construction program. We had laid down or planned 16 modern battleships in 1916. We're planning a 1919 plan called for 16 more to get laid down or authorized in 1920, with more to come. The British would feel obliged to match us in building. At this point, remember, Britain is still a global superpower. They more so than the United States. The United States could outmatch them industrially, though probably not by shipbuilding industry. The United States could outmatch them economically, but the British still felt that the Britannia should rule the waves and needed to rule the waves. So they needed to at least match a U.S. arms buildup, even though they didn't consider us to be an enemy or a potential enemy. The picture I'm showing here is USS Maryland, our most recent, with her capital ship Colorado, were our most recent buildings, naval battleship buildings, 16-inch guns. Throughout World War I, generally the nations had started World War I with 13.5 or 14-inch guns as the standard, going to 15-inch guns through World War I. 16-inch guns started to be what the new standard were, and Maryland was essentially the same as the previous Tennessee class. If you look at them side by side, they look similar, except the Maryland class had twin 16-inch guns to the triple 14-inch guns on the Tennessee class. However, if you look inside, the armor was upgraded as well. A 16-inch gun battleship is supposed to be able to duel it out with other 16-inch gun battleships and would be armored appropriately. And so were the Colorados. So we had So we had two Marylands going into the operational or near operational going into the conference. We had two more under construction, West Virginia and Washington, when the conference started. And these ships did 21 knots, which for the U.S. was a reasonable fast speed for a battleship at the time. Now, we were planning much larger, more powerful, and more expensive warships on the ways under construction. For Lexington-class battlecruisers, this is our example of a Lexington-class battlecruiser. She had 8 16-inch guns, so she had essentially the same main armament as the Maryland class, but she did 33 knots, and if you'll see, she has about 9 to 10,000 tons greater displacement. So we added 10,000 tons of the ship with the same main armament, but it gave her an additional 12 knot speed. That's typically what you do with a battlecruiser. These are the first battlecruisers I've ever seen that the United States ever considered building. We had built up to World War I. We had built battleships exclusively. Now we were following up the Maryland class battleship design with the South Dakota class battleship, which added 4 16-inch guns to the design. Still maintained 21 to 23 knots, but we're in the same displacement range as the Lexington class, 43,000 tons. Now these were 1916 program designs, but the construction had been delayed to allow more escorts to be built in World War I to complete the campaign against the German U-boats. And then they were redesigned to integrate lessons learned from the Battle of Jutland. There are other designs in the drawing boards up to 80,000 tons with 24 16-inch guns. These are the Tillman class battleships. I'll go into those in another slide. They were not really realistic. Congress was not likely to actually vote for them. The Navy wasn't interested in trying to build and crew them, but they would have been concerning for Britain that America was looking at these larger things. The artist depiction here is the USS Saratoga, which was under construction along with the sister ship Lexington, which was under construction with USS Saratoga. They would be completed as aircraft carriers, and we'll discuss further how the Washington Naval Treaty caused that to happen. The Tillman battleships, also called the Maximum battleships, they're named after Senator Pitchfork Benjamin Tillman, who in late 1916 and early 1917 had insisted that the Navy present some design studies to him for very large battleships going up to 80,000 tons. Remember, at the time, battleships were 33,000 tons. The new battleships coming out were 43,000 tons. 80,000 ton battleships were in fact massive. The Navy wasn't interested, but decided they needed the support from of the Committee on Naval Affairs, on which Tillman sat. And the designs did influence the design of the Tennessee, Maryland, and the South Dakota class battleships. Now, when I talk about the South Dakota class, these are not the World War II South Dakota class built in the late 1930s. These were follow-on to the Maryland and Tennessee classes. These are some of the Tillman series. You can see the kind of almost ridiculous things we're talking about. 70,000 ton to 63,000 ton displacement, 12 16-inch guns on the Tillman 1 going to 24 16-inch guns. These would be in sextuple turrets, 4 6-gun turrets in this design. They cut down on some of the armor and increased the armament. And with the Tillman 3, they went back to a more realistic 12 16-inch guns, but kicked the ship up to 30 knots. With the Tillman 4, they're now talking back to 24 16-inch guns and heavier armor, but they've gone up to 80,000 tons to allow the greater armor. The Tillman 4-1 and 2 types in 1917 are building onto that 80,000 ton ships, 25 knots with 18-inch guns, 13 and 15. How do you get 13? Well, 3, 2, 2, 3, 2, 3. So everything on the main deck is, well, I think that's a 2. Everything in the main deck are triples, but whatever is on a barbette is a double twin gun. So that helps with your stability considerations. And these are going to 80. Now, these are all generally the size are all at 975 feet. What we actually designed in late and authorized as the South Dakota class in 1918, a more realistic 43,000 ton, 660 feet with 12 16-inch guns and good armor for a 16-inch gun battleship. So that's where our starting point is with the South Dakotas and the Lexingtons, and a potential to get even larger, an expectation that we were going to go even larger. Great Britain has global superpower status at this point. She has had for a century. A result of 17th to 19th century colonialism, economic and industrial expansion. Britain is not the basket case that we're used to seeing her coming out of World War II with. Britain here is a very, very powerful country, the most powerful, arguably the most powerful country on the world. She wouldn't be when America actually woke up and decided they wanted to be. But Britain at this point, Britannia ruled the waves, and Britain had pretty much dominance in every theater. Now, Britain was in danger of being eclipsed by the U.S. And many people say that World War I was really about the implications of Germany becoming a superpower, at least at the continent. And that could be argued, but Germany, of course, at this point has been defeated. The United States has a history of isolationism, and the United Kingdom therefore still has the role of the global superpower intact in 1922. However, her economy is suffering dramatically after fighting World War I for 4 years. They've lost a lot of people. They have serious war debt. Their population is very tired. They're interested in implementing exterior measures. They would rather not spend a fortune on new warships, especially if the required spending is to match the United States, whom they don't see as an enemy. So they have oppressive naval requirements. They still are the world's largest, most complex and far-flung empire, which is central to their superpower economy. They had to have the strongest navy in the world. By tradition, the public demanded it, the public expected it. Britannia had to rule the waves, and backing away from that was not a politically viable option. They have imperial and global security concerns. They have a modern fleet of battleships, 10, and battlecruisers with 15-inch guns. And 15-inch guns were the standard coming out of World War I as the largest thing you have. And that's also not counting the 15-inch gun battleships and battlecruisers that they had acquired from the Germans at the end of the war. I haven't mentioned here also 2 light cruisers that they had with 15-inch guns as well. So the 15-inch gun battleship was quickly becoming obsolete. The ships were under construction by the U.S., the Maryland class by Japan, the Nagato class we'll talk about in a moment, with 16-inch guns and appropriately upgraded armor. We're going to make those potentially obsolete. 1921's British naval estimates planned 4 battleships and 4 battlecruisers for 1921, and another 4 battleships to be planned in 1922. That's an expenditure the British would rather not have made. What they were in fact planning on beginning to lay down were the N3 class battleship. And here I compare the N3 class battleship to the previous Queen Elizabeth class battleship, which was their most advanced battleship to date. They had 4 N3s planned. They had 5 Queen Elizabeths. The N3 was 48,000 tons displacement compared to the Queen Elizabeth's 32 and a half. So it's a quantum leap. She had 9 18-inch guns in this battleship, compared to the Queen Elizabeth's 8 15-inch guns. So they were going to take a leap beyond what the Americans and what the Japanese were building at the time. She could do 23 knots, to the Queen Elizabeth 24. That's rather fast for a battleship in that day, and they considered that to be acceptable, obviously. And this shows the determination of Britain and the Royal Navy to stay on top of the arms race. I have a diagram of the uncompleted, they never laid one of these down, N3 class battleship. Note of interest, the grouping of the main guns forward. This allowed for them to make an armored belt that was smaller than what would normally be necessary. Ever since the days when we first put down Monitor, the ironclads had iron all over and everything was armored. But and actually, an American advance in the just somewhat and around 1910, 1912 was the concept of all or nothing armor scheme, meaning we put minimal armor on anything that doesn't actually need to be protected, allowing us to concentrate our displacement and our armor around the things that needed to be to keep the ship in the fight. Now, you needed to armor the magazines for survival. You needed to armor the guns and the engineering spaces and the command and control space to keep the ship in the fight. But this type of arrangement would allow the British to make an armored box around the core of the ship and leave the rest of it relatively lightly armored. So nine 18-inch guns in this. This is the G3 class battlecruiser. They were planning 4 of them, and here I compare it to the Admiralty class, of which they only built the hood, to see where things have gone. He's again 48,000 tons. So in displacement, this is a similar size ship to what the N3 was going to be. Hood was not much smaller. Remember, Hood was an enormous ship by 1920 standards. There was nothing anywhere near in the world as big as Hood was at the time. She had 9 16-inch guns to Hood's 8 15s and did 32 knots, which was considered acceptable. You also see the same configuration of main guns forward, allowing them to put an armored box around the main engineering and magazine spaces. This is a model of uncompleted G3 class battlecruiser, similar to N3, but these are 16-inch guns instead of 18s and a much faster speed on a similar hull size. Now, when we talk G and N and whatever, the British started a series of designs after World War I, starting with the battlecruiser K class and the battleship L class. And they went up from there. Follow-on battleship designs went from K to M and ultimately to N, which is what they were getting ready to start building in 1922. The Ks moved back from K to J to I to H to G. So this is actually about the 5th different design. Where it's G3 means that these triple turrets. There is a G2 class design, which they did not decide to start building. These are up to 53 kilotons, 1,000 tons with these designs. 48 seems kind of reasonable. The British actually laid down one G3, the first of their G3s, in November 1921, when the conference was starting. Where France was by comparison, relatively pathetic. Remember, France didn't have the same naval tradition as Britain. They had a serious conflict with Germany called World War I, and most of World War I was in fact fought on French soil. So most of the French built funding and resources went into fighting the Germans in the trench line. They had fought a bitter World War I conflict. They were also tired and were interested in austerity measures. They felt they had oppressive naval requirements as well. Their Navy was already small and borderline obsolete. They still had 13 pre-dreadnought class type battleships in their service in 1921. So at this time, those were largely obsolete in 1906. The most modern battleship was the Bretagne class. She's 26,000 tons, and remember that we're building 30. U.S., Britain, and Japan are building 33 to 39,000 ton battleships at this point, with 15-inch, 16-inch guns. So their most modern ship had 13.4-inch guns. This is Provence, Bretagne class. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I never took French. The French see Italy as their adversary for control of the Mediterranean. They also have a far-flung empire that was almost as large as Britain's, and they felt they could justify a larger fleet than Italy because they needed to be able to stand off Italy in the Mediterranean and still patrol a far-flung geopolitical empire. They're unlikely to be able to compete in an arms race industrially or physically in this decade. So they're not in a very good negotiating position, but they would love for a series, something to come out of this conference that would allow them to avoid any future building. Italy was even a more poor position than France was at this point. Italy's navy had been designed to oppose the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, of course, in the wake of World War I, the empire itself ceased to exist. Their navy was relatively low funded and there's relative inexperience in the Italian shipyards. It took them a long time to build a battleship, to the point where a battleship was nearly obsolete when it came out. They had 5 dreadnought battleships with 12-inch guns and 6 being completed. They're still finishing a 6th ship with 12-inch guns when the major nations are working on 16-inch guns battleships. They felt justified in demanding parity with France. Their desires for what they would like to build exceeded their ability to fund and to build it. So they also want a deal. This is their most modern battleship in 1921, 13 12-inch guns. How do you get that? Well, 3.2, 3.23. So I think she's commissioned in 1916 with 12-inch guns. This is the Andrea, and she was 24,000 tons. Again, small and weak. Japan is where things get interesting. She had a small navy, but high quality. Japan had a proud tradition after the Battle of Tsushima Strait, defeating the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, 2 major battles. Japan had regional ambitions. They were the most industrialized country in Asia, and they felt they had almost their own manifest destiny to dominate issues in Asia. Of course, empires such as Britain and the economic industrial empire of the United States would have problems with that. Japan had an AngloJapanese Alliance with Britain, and they could have reached some understanding potentially. Japan, like the United States, had small war debt and no war weariness. Japan did contribute to World War I. Some of their destroyers got torpedoed in the Mediterranean by German and Australian U-boats. But at this point, they had essentially no war weariness. They saw the U.S. as their strategic competition in the Far East, and some, in fact, at this point, saw war with the U.S. as inevitable. After the United States, they're best prepared, they're best able to afford a naval arms race. Now, they had a planning tradition built around an 8-8 plan of battleships, 8 battleships and 8 armored cruisers. That goes back to 1910, the wake of their victory at Tsushima. They saw 8 battle cruisers in terms of the 4 Congo class they had, and 4 14-inch gun battleships of the Fuso and Ise classes. And they were going to build 4 16-inch gun battleships of the Nagato and Tosa classes, and 4 Amagi class battle cruisers to round out their 8-8 plan. Because after World War I, they transitioned from a battleship armored cruiser plan to a battleship battle cruiser plan. Now, after the U.S. 1919 expansion plan with 16 capital ships on the way with 16-inch guns, potentially up to 18-inch guns, on top of the 16 that were authorized in 1916, the Japanese redefined the 8-8 plan in 1920. Nagato and Tosa, the 16-inch gun battleships, would be the first 4 of their 8-8 battleships, and with 4 18-inch gun battleships to follow. They would build the Kii class, a fast battleship with 16-inch guns, to fill out their 8 battle cruisers. The model seen here is a Tosa class battleship. This is the battleship that KAGA would have been had she been completed as a battleship instead of an aircraft carrier. Again, pushing 40,000 tons, 10 16-inch guns, 16.1s. I think it's 410 millimeter. There are 2 of these were under construction in 1921. They did 26.5 knots. So these were reasonably good ships, very fast for battleships and well armed and well armored. So the summary of all starting points for the 5 nations: Japan was embarking on a buildup aimed at dominance in Asia and achieving appropriate global respect. That's one of the things they always saw, that the West didn't respect them even after they kicked the Soviets' butts in the Russians' butts in the Russo-Japanese War. But they still thought the West largely didn't take them seriously. The U.S. was embarking on a naval buildup aimed at maintaining our status as a great power and responding to the Japanese buildup to maintain power in Asia. Britain needed to remain a step above everyone else, especially in this case that meant the United States. For the sake of tradition, public expectation, and imperial security, Japan had to rule the waves, and they had to build what they needed to show that they ruled the waves. France needed to control a far-flung empire and to be able to counter Italy in the Mediterranean. Italy saw a need to counter the France in the Mediterranean. Wilson's 1919 expansion plan was unpopular with Congress and with the U.S. public. The public wanted a global disarmament conference and didn't want to spend the money. Congress didn't want to spend the money. And Warren Harding winning the 1920 election permitted a shift in policy away from Wilson's expansionistic policy. Britain wanted to lock in naval superiority rather than have to spend money to maintain naval superiority against in a naval arms race. Japan saw an arms race with the U.S. as undesirable, given the economic and industrial disparity. They would lose an arms race with the United States. France and Britain both wanted to avoid the arms race, the cost of an arms race. And in 1921, Britain was planning a conference to discuss the strategic situation in the Pacific and the Far East. The Harding administration wanted to preempt that. They called for the Washington Naval Conference to forestall the British conference and to satisfy domestic demands. The conference started on November 21st, 1921, and in the first plenary session and the opening address, U.S. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes said, "The way to disarm is to disarm." That was an ambitious slogan that received enthusiastic public support in the United States, likely gained momentum for U.S. proposals at the conference. The initial U.S. proposal was a 10-year holiday on capital ship construction, which stopped building battleships, battlecruisers, period. This included an immediate suspension of all building, scrapping existing or planning capital ships to give a ratio between Britain, U.S., Japan, Italy, and France tonnage of 5 to 5 to 3 to 1 2/3 to 1 2/3. The ongoing tonnage limits with continued building would range 5-5-3 ratio in both capital ships and secondary vessels. This is Charles Evans Hughes and Admiral Hilary P. Jones, who was at that point Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet on USS Maryland, our most advanced battleship in 1922. Now, the British reaction to the American proposal was mostly in favor. They didn't want to continue spending. Liked the idea of major budget reductions due to a post-war recession. There was a major concession if they were going to be matched to the United States in the 5 to 5 ratio of tonnage. Britannia should rule the waves. They wouldn't maintain it. They felt they wouldn't maintain an adequate fleet in the North Sea, Mediterranean, and Far East simultaneously. This brought some outrage from parts of the Royal Navy that said these are our strategic requirements. We can't possibly do this. The Japanese reaction to the delegation was divided. Their naval doctrine called for a fleet 70% the size of the U.S. fleet at the time. They imagined that a war with the U.S. would be conducted in 2 battles. First the battle with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, then with the battle with the U.S. Atlantic Fleet that came through the Panama Canal to fight. They calculated that a 7 to 5 ratio in the first battle would produce enough of margin of victory that they would be able to win the second. So they would overwhelm us and have and cause a greater attrition ratio and have enough left over that they would be able to take on the second. The proposed ratio of 5 to 3 by the United States would imply a 6 to 5 ratio in the first battle, which would not be adequate to meet their strategic needs. Nevertheless, they were inclined to accept because they knew Japan would lose an arms race with the United States, and an arms race might cause Japan to suffer an economic crisis. In 1921, Japan had 55% of the U.S. capital ships and 18% of the U.S. gross domestic product. So they had overbuilt based on the size of their economy. Kaito Kanji was the president of the Naval Staff College. Tomosaburo acted as Tomosaburo. He was the main architect and negotiator, acted as his chief aide, but their opinions differed. He represented influential big Navy opinion. Japan had to prepare as thoroughly as possible for what they saw as an inevitable conflict with the United States. Ultimately, Tomosaburo persuaded the Japanese High Command to accept the Hughes proposals, but the treaty that locked in a 5 to 3 ratio between the U.S. and Japan and tonnage, capital ship tonnage, was a source of controversy in the Japanese Navy for years to come. I want to just touch briefly on the early American magic. American magic was referred to as our ability to crack Japanese codes, but an American Black Chamber project in the 1920s, the Cipher Bureau of the U.S. Intelligence Service, was spying on the delegation's communications with their capitals. Japanese communications were being deciphered thoroughly. That allowed American negotiators to know the absolute minimum possible deal that the Japanese would accept. So we were playing this game at the time. And that's important to remember that we were able to, at that point, negotiate the Japanese into a corner. The Italian reaction to the Hughes proposal The tonnage limits allowed more building than Italy was likely to be able to pull off in the next decade anyway. As long as it guaranteed parity with France, they were fine. Parity with France would never actually be achieved owing to the Italian economy and the Italian shipbuilding industries. The French reaction, they initially opposed the capital ship tonnage limit. They demanded they be slightly above the Japanese limit because they felt it, again, far-flung empire, and they needed to keep capital ships in Pacific as well as the Mediterranean to stand off Italy. They had to get concessions in cruisers and submarines in order to get the French to agree to this. So once we agreed to allow French building on cruisers and submarines, the French agreed to the capital ship limitations. French also thought the Italians had no basis to insist on parity, but the American and British delegations pressured the French to accept this. Now, moving on from capital ships, the Hughes proposal wanted the same ratio, 5-5-3, 1.5, 1 2/3, 1 2/3 for cruisers and destroyers. These limits were both unacceptable to the British and the French. Those large, far-flung empires, they needed these lighter ships to patrol those empires. The British cited their imperial commitments and said they had to be allowed 50% more support ships, cruisers and destroyers than the United States and Japan. The French also cited imperial commitments, saying that the fact that they were giving up so much capital ship tonnage, they needed more cruisers to be essential to patrolling their empire. As a result, any limit on total cruiser tonnage or total cruiser numbers was rejected, and they couldn't reach an agreement with the Washington Naval Treaty to limit the number of cruisers. They did, however, reach agreement on limiting the size and strength of what was defined to be a cruiser. After all, if you can limit capital ships, you don't want somebody building a 30,000-ton 18-inch gunship and calling it a cruiser and getting around the limits that way. So the British suggested a 10,000-ton maximum displacement. There were armored cruisers larger than that in World War I, but they were at this point interested in retaining the Hawkins class they were building. This is HMS Raleigh Hawkins class, 9.9 thousand tons with 7.5-inch guns, 31 knots. And this was the base of the British proposal. The British proposed a maximum 8-inch gun size for cruisers. You can't have anything larger than 8s. And this also coincided with American requirements where we felt we needed cruisers to patrol long-range Pacific operations, and with Japanese plans for the Ikagya class. It was a reasonable proposal that the British had that was acceptable to the U.S. and the Japanese. This proposal was adopted with little debate. Starting to build cruisers to these limits, 10,000 tons at 8-inch. This is as big as we could do, so we're going to turn as many of these as we can. And the term treaty cruiser came into being to refer to a cruiser built to the Washington Naval Treaty maximums. And by the 1930s, this evolved into the term heavy cruiser. Now, we kind of think of the heavy cruiser and light cruiser as the two things opposing each other. The fact is, the term light cruiser had at this point existed for about 10 years, and the heavy cruiser came into being in the 1930s. They matched each other, and that kind of made sense. So the way things worked out, but the term light cruiser and heavy cruiser did not come into being at the same time. Destroyers. Remember, at this point, a destroyer is something to be operated in flotillas and something that was relatively short range. The proposal to limit destroyer tonnage met the same objections as the cruisers. From the French, given that the capital ship's tonnage they were being asked to give up made a large number of destroyers essential. As a result, any limit on total destroyer tonnage or numbers was also rejected. They could not reach any agreement to the Washington Naval Treaty. Submarines were an interesting story here. The British demanded an abolition of all submarines. They hated submarines from the start, considered damned un-English. They were still smarting from the losses they had received from the German unrestricted warfare campaign in 1917 and 1918. And they never liked what the German had done with the submarines and their design and implementation, and they thought that submarines ought to be outlawed. French insisted that submarines were a crucial piece of their national security strategy, probably eyeing Italy. There had been a lot of submarine fights in the Mediterranean growing up. During World War I, and they felt that they needed an allowance of 90,000 tons of submarines. That would have been a lot of submarines at the time. The conference again ended without an agreement to restrict submarines at all. Now, at that point, the conference wanted to start to discuss specific cases of capital ship, what classes would be allowed to retain, and how many of each. They limited the same limits cruisers. They limited capital ships to 35,000 tons for new capital ship construction. Guns could be no larger than 16 inches. Japan had rushed to finish Mutsu, the second of their 16-inch gun battleship, the second ship of the Nagato class, before the conference, making it harder to negotiate the ship away once it's out and running. So Mutsu is out there, and Japan has their two 16-inch gun-ships. To meet tonnage limits, the United States was permitted to complete the third ship of the Maryland class, the Colorado, the West Virginia, with 16-inch guns. They sunk the fourth, the Washington, as a target. The British had no 16-inch gun battleships at the time. They still had 10 advanced 15-inch gun battleships that were going to be placed obsolete rather quickly. So they cried foul, saying, "Hey, if we're going to if the U.S. is going to have their three 16-inch gun battleships and Japan their two 16-inch battleships, we need to be allowed to build 16-inch gun battleships as well." They started laying down the G3 battlecruiser with 16-inch guns, although that was going to be broken up by the terms of the treaty. So the British got a negotiated agreement to build two 16-inch gun battleships, which turned out to be the Nelson class, the Nelson and Rodney. They called these the O3 type. After N3, the next design was the O3. They're cut down designs from the N3. And here is, in fact, Nelson off Spithead in 1937 for review. We see some of the 15-inch gun battleships, the Revenge class in the background. For 10 years, the Nelsons would be the most powerful battleships in the world. Nine 16-inch guns to 8s on the Nagatos or the Marylands, 35,000 tons, and probably with a better armament scheme. And if you ask me to place bets on the two Nelsons versus the two Nagatos, or the two Nelsons versus two of the Marylands in an open fight, I would bet on the Nelsons. I don't think I'd bet on the two Nelsons against all three American 16-inch gun battleships. For what it's worth, the British had not only negotiated tonnage parity with the United States, but they can point to having the two most powerful capital ships in the world, the battleships in the world, in terms of the Nelsons. They could also point to having the single most impressive capital ship in the world with the Hood, because the 35,000 ton limitation installed by the Washington Naval Treaty rendered Hood as 10,000 ton, 8 to 10,000 tons larger than any other capital ship anybody had. So the British had these things they could hold up saying, "See, Britannia still rules the waves because we have got all these things." Now, carriers get very interesting at this point. They're still an inclusive experiment as of 1921. The treaty limited their displacement to 27,000 tons, no more than 10 heavy guns to a maximum 8-inch gun size. You can't use your tonnage limitation to build carriers to instead build something you called a carrier, but instead put 18-inch guns on it. Each signatory was allowed to use two existing capital ship hulls for aircraft carriers with a displacement limit of 33,000 tons each. That's what allowed the United States to convert Lexington and Saratoga into aircraft carriers. The Japanese planned to convert the battlecruisers Ikagya and Amagi into battlecruisers. Were foiled by the Great Santo earthquake in September 1923 that destroyed Amagi on the building ways. Instead, the Japanese took the KAGA battleship, KAGA class battleship they were building, which hadn't been broken up yet, would have had to have been, and converted that into an aircraft carrier. So that's why we have the United States started World War II with two battlecruisers converted to aircraft carriers, and the Japanese had a cattle cruiser and a battleship instead, two different designs. Now, the treaty defined an aircraft carrier as a warship greater than 10,000 tons, constructed exclusively for launching and landing aircraft. Carriers were carriers that were lighter than 10,000 tons did not count toward this tonnage limit. Japan did a lot to try to exploit this and try to make viable carriers under 10,000 tons. And that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of Japanese light carriers in service at the beginning of World War II. Because they're trying to get under the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty. The first London Naval Treaty closed that loophole. All aircraft carriers in service are building. The British Argus, Eagle, Furious, and Hermes classes, American Langley, and Japanese Hosho were declared experimental, and they were not counted toward these limitations. Ultimately, limits were reached on capital ship tonnage, the same as aircraft carrier tonnage. The capital ship tonnage, the British, 525,000 tons, as well as the Americans, Japanese, and France, Italy and France following suit based on the ratio. The carrier ratio became 5, 5, 3, and 2 and 2. And the allowed tonnage was 135,000 tons, 81,000, 60,000. And nobody would really start trying to build to those until into the 1930s. And just a little bit of show and tell pictures. I got some time to kill here. This is the outline of the Ikagya. She would have been completed as a battle cruiser with 10 16-inch guns in twin turrets. And this is how he was initially completed after the results of the Washington Naval Treaty. Note that she actually had, this is her hangar deck here. You could fly aircraft out of the hangar deck. There was a lot of experimentation, especially by the Japanese, with trying to launch aircraft out of the hangar deck while using the main deck as the recovery space. You'd also see some problems the Japanese routinely have figuring out where they're going to route their exhaust. Ikagya was reconverted in the 1930s to a more conventional design with a full deck. They gave up on this launching planes out of the hangar deck. As planes became larger and heavier, it became unfeasible in the first place. The Japanese experimented with port and starboard designs to try to keep the main island structure away from the exhaust with two of their ships, but they were the only ships that actually, they were the only nation that actually experimented with trying to port-side mounted island structures. This is KAGA, again, as a model of KAGA as designed as a battleship with 16-inch guns. And as completed, also we see the launching systems to launch aircraft out of the hangar deck. There were I think she had 3 hangar decks, the latter one being smaller. Ikagya had 2 hangar decks. You couldn't launch out of the lower one, but they could store more planes there. And this very, very long funnel they built into the design to try to get the exhaust away from the main deck where it wouldn't impinge on aircraft trying to come in. When you start to suck in smoke-filled air, it kills the amount of oxygen your engine has. You suddenly lose power, and when you're heading toward a flight deck, that's the last time you want to lose power. So they had these bizarre configurations to try to do that. And there was an actual conning area up here. There's no island structure. The ship was conned from up forward. Here is another view of KAGA in 1925. These are 8-inch guns, twin 8-inch guns up forward. And an aircraft being launched out of the hangar deck was launched between 2 8-inch guns. That would be interesting to see the area she was being conned from up here. And here she is rebuilt in 1940 to a more conventional full-deck aircraft carrier design, and doing away with that very, very long configuration, but trying to route the exhaust smoke down and away from the main deck. This is the battlecruiser Lexington. She would have been designed with again 8 16-inch guns. And here she is in the building ways being completed as an aircraft carrier. 8-inch guns in the main deck. She was built with 8 guns as main armament. I think Lexington retained that until she was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. I think Lexingtons were removed in 1942 as part of their revisions to put in more 5-inch guns, which were more suitable for anti-aircraft. We can see more older designs, the biplanes that she was launching. So it was a good design, and it's hard to overstate the importance of these designs in early naval aviation. Up to that point, we had Langley, and I'll show you Langley in a few minutes, which could do maybe 22, 23 knots. Lexington could do 32 at least easily, and that the amount of wind you could put across your flight deck helps with stability and safety in landing, and what the size and weight of an aircraft you could launch. And the extent of the main flight deck allowed us to exercise to build plane types we would never have been able to employ on Langley, and to exercise with naval strategy and doctrine that we would never have been able to do with Langley airships like it. Japanese had the same advantages working with Ikagya and KAGA, learning lessons from them that helped them with their 1930s designs. This is Lexington. It's rebuilt in 1940. Again, you see the 8-inch. She still has the 8-inch guns that would be turned into 5-inch guns for better anti-aircraft. Because the cruiser captains, the battleship captains said again in the day in the early 1920s when the viability of an aircraft carrier seemed to be in question. If we're going to build a ship, 33,000 tons and crew, it better have the type of gunnery that would allow her to take part in a cruiser fight. And she would have been one heck of a cruiser because, again, she was armed below deck. She was armored and compartmented as a battlecruiser. Now, some of these ships that were declared experimental by the Washington Naval Treaty and not counted. This is HMS Furia. She was actually completed as a light cruiser with two 18-inch guns, a single 18-inch gun forward and aft. It never considered particularly a viable design. The reload time was so long that a spotter calling for a shot, it was too late to correct full a shot before you get the second by the time you can get the second round off. At any rate, at first, as an experiment, they put a flight deck in the front of the aircraft carrier. The superstructure was still there, and so you could launch aircraft from the front. You were expected to, and again, these are biplanes that could, at a relatively small stall speed, come in around the superstructure and bank in and settle the aircraft down and make a landing. And the guy who first tried that pulled it off. The second time he tried it, he went over the side and killed himself. So that was not considered proper. So proper to do that. And they eventually cleared off the aft deck and put another flight deck in there. So there was launch and recovery. So they used the front deck for launch and the aft deck for recovery. That never really worked there very well either. It was a lot of turbulence trying to come in on an aft deck with this size superstructure. She was eventually reconfigured to a full deck conversion in the 1921 to 25 series, along with two sister ships, Courageous and Glorious, also light cruisers built with each 4 15-inch guns. Were converted to the same essential tech. Note, interestingly, a slope down and a slope up. This would help, was designed to help an aircraft landing decelerate and an aircraft launch accelerate. Anyway, Furious was the first ship to actually take an aircraft landing on a ship while moving. And she saw service into World War II, including strike convoy operations as an aircraft ferry. She launched aircraft against Tirpitz, and she was scrapped in 1948, so she survived. Experimental carrier HMS Argus, the next British series, was 14,000 tons. What was almost 20,000 tons for the Furious. Again, she was built as a light cruiser with 18-inch guns, which I'd call a battlecruiser. 14,000 tons. So she's larger than cruisers typically. She was converted. She was under construction as an ocean liner and reconverted. It's the first example of a standard pattern full deck aircraft carrier. She saw service into World War II when Royal Navy was short on carriers, but she soon was relegated to training and ferry duties. Again, she was scrapped in 47. HMS Hermes was the first ship designed as an aircraft carrier. Hosho was the first ship commissioned. So the Japanese were faster building Hosho than the British were building Hermes. Again, she's getting smaller, 11,000 tons for this ship. She also saw service into World War II, attacking the French ship Richelieu, Vichy French with Swordfish. Mostly she took a station in the Indian Ocean after that, looking for largely German armed merchant raiders. She's ultimately sunk by the Kudo Butai, the Japanese first air fleet, in April 1942 by Japanese Val dive bombers. Again, we see a nice normal, what we start to see as a normal configuration of an aircraft carrier. So they're experimenting. They're starting to get it right. Eagle, now we're up to 20,000 tons in 1924 vintage. She was laid down as a dreadnought for Chile before World War I. She was purchased by UK for conversion in 1918 into an aircraft carrier, and we could see how she was being developed and converted. She saw service in World War II. She was sunk by the German U-boat U-73 in August 1942. Britain used her for trials to determine the optimal layout for aircraft carriers. Now, here's where the Japanese were going. This is the first Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hosho, in 1922. She's small, 7,500 tons, about 15 aircraft. She's the world's first commissioned aircraft carrier, built as an aircraft carrier. So the British laid down Furious or whatever, Hermes before she did, but the Japanese got this into the water and operating first. Again, we see a slope down to try to help an aircraft build up on a sufficient flight speed. If I were a pilot, I may be worried about getting aimed toward the sea on launch, but I think the pilots knew what they were doing. She tested Japanese used her to test carrier operations, equipment techniques, provided valuable lessons learned and experience in early carrier operations. She was small in the opening stages of the Sino-Japanese War, fighting the Chinese. She supported ground operations, after which she was generally relegated to trading operations, except she was used in a secondary role at Midway. She, strangely enough, survived World War II. Now, this is the U.S. experimental carrier Langley. She is as a collier, converted to an aircraft carrier in 1920. Conversion of the ship of a sister ship was canceled by the Naval Treaty, but the Naval Treaty again allowed us to convert Lexington and Saratoga, which were going to be 33,000-ton aircraft carriers compared to the 12,000-ton Langley. She was converted to a seaplane tender in 1937. She was scuttled after a Japanese air attack in February 42. Moving on, additional clauses that came out of the Washington Naval Treaty, which are nevertheless just as important. The treaty prohibited the British, Japanese, and the U.S. from constructing new fortifications or naval bases in the Pacific region. We can complete what we had. We could continue to have what we had, but couldn't build anymore. Existing fortifications in Singapore, British, Philippines, and Hawaii, American, could remain. The Japanese saw this as a significant diplomatic victory, essentially guaranteeing they would remain a dominant position in the Western Pacific. The provision was crucial in gaining Japanese acceptance to the terms on capital ship construction. Now, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance ends. It was an unofficial effect of the treaty. Not a part of the treaty, but the American delegates made it clear to the British that they needed to end their treaty with Japan if they were going to move forward with this treaty. The path at this point was set for a Japanese-U.S. confrontation at some point in East Asia. Not that that's what we're looking for, but we were looking to make sure that the Japanese wouldn't have Britain second-guessing us on anything statement we wanted to make to the Japanese. So conclusions of this, and I should be wrapping up here. The treaty was concluded in February 1922. Ratifications in Washington by the U.S. were exchanged in 1923. It was registered with League of Nations Treaty Series in April 1924. The conference did head off capital ship building rates that nobody wanted to pay for by initiating a 10-year moratorium on new battleship production. The treaty locked the Japanese into an inferiority with the United States, which is one of a perceived string of perceived snubs by the West that helped stoke nationalistic fervor in the 1930s and was a contributing factor to the start of the Pacific War. The treaty warped cruiser design. The term treaty cruiser of 10,000 tons at 8-inch guns became a baseline. Secondary design missions became lost. Now, the scout cruiser that existed before, remember in 1910, there were no there was no radar, and aircraft were few and far between and were still experimental. The scout cruisers were built to allow a naval force and a battle line to get some feel for what is out ahead of them or what is beyond their visual horizon. The scout cruiser largely went away as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty. As at the same time, also more and more aircraft were being introduced both on the decks of capital ships as well as the aircraft carriers that were being built. So that made the scout cruiser role obsolete. Going into the late 20s and early 30s were a number of violations and accused violations. Just an example of this, multiple accusations of ships, nations representing tonnage. The Richelieu, the French 15-inch gun battleship in the 30s, put France over the battleship tonnage limits. Trento and Zara classes of cruiser substantially were over the 10,000-ton limit. Those were Italian. When Britain complained about Richelieu and Jean Bart, the French ships over the tonnage limits, France countered that Britain had by that point signed an Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935 that largely dismantled the German disarmament clauses of Versailles. German naval rearmament threatened France, and the French argued that if Britain freely violated treaty obligations, France would feel similarly unconstrained. The terms of the treaty were modified by the London Naval Treaty of 1930 and the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936. That included the 35,000 ton limitation on tonnage was retained, but they were cut down to 14-inch guns. But the stipulation was that if Japan had signed into the treaty in 18 months, that limit would be lifted to 45,000 tons and 16-inch guns. And that affected some of the U.S. and British construction limits. King George V class is a lot more weird than she would have. In fact, it would not be what the Royal Navy would have wanted to build, but she met the treaty limits. The same thing, the U.S. North Carolina Washington classes were designed with 14-inch guns, 14-inch guns, completed with 16-inch guns, and didn't have the kind of balance of gunnery and armor that the U.S. Navy would have wanted. Anyway, by the mid-1930s, Japan and Italy renounced the treaty entirely. Yamamoto argued that they should remain in the treaty, that the U.S. could easily outproduce Japan by the 5-3 ratio stipulated by the treaty. His quote was, "Anyone who's seen the auto factories of Detroit and oil fields of Texas knows that Japan lacks the power for a naval race with America." But nobody listened to him at the time. Germany was not a signatory to the Washington Naval Treaty. They renounced the Treaty of Versailles that had limited their navy in 1935 and began their own naval buildup. Naval arms limitations became increasingly difficult for other signatories as well. So largely these things just kind of reached an expiration date as the nations began to build beyond those limits, larger and more ships than necessary. But for now, we had in the 1920s and 1930s a building plan that was shaped by the Washington Naval Treaty that largely shaped a lot what the size scope of forces that a lot of the navies entered World War II with. And that's my limit. I think I'm a minute or two over, but I'll stay along to answer questions for as long as we want. Note I have another lecture to start at 8 o'clock, so I'm interested in coming up before then. So thank you for participating. And Merle, you still there to first background? Maybe not. So okay.
Yeah, I'm lurking.
As I hadn't seen anything in chat. Any questions?
So I have a couple of questions. One is mine, which is how does this impact the development of carriers? Because you talked about that tangentially, but I'm wondering if you saw something specific.
Well, it would have been difficult for any of the navies to start to convince their legislatures or their politicians to start building aircraft carriers of 25, 30,000 tons. As you can see from what we were building, we converted a collier that was about 14,000, but it's close to 20,000 tons. But a conversion is not optimal. You want to build something from the ground up. The Enterprise class itself was about 18,000. So actually building a ship the size of Lexington or Ikagya was not something that either the U.S. or the Japanese navies were likely to be able to get their legislatures or to agree with, and not likely to get out of the economies at the time. So this allowed them to put very large ships in the water, very fast ships in the water, and allowed them to experiment with aircraft that they would not have been able to launch from Hosho or her follow-ons or anything following on Langley. So I think it went a long way toward developing naval aviation and gave them a leg up that they might not have reached on their own for 10 or 15 years. We knew a lot about what would go into the Enterprise design, the Japanese, what would go into the Soryu, Hiryu, and ultimately Shokuku designs based on experimentation with these large aircraft carriers that we would not have been able to build. The British had their own series, and they were interested in playing with the carriers they had. 5 or 8 carriers they had that were reasonably good until they actually went into building arc oil in 37, 38, I think. So the British were they needed to put their focus. They knew, I think, on small ships and anti-submarine warfare, as well as patrolling a large empire, and building a large carrier fleet was not anything that was a primary importance to them.
So one of our listeners and viewers is interested in modern perceptions of the treaty, particularly he's mentioned later the impact on SALT and other kinds of disarmament conferences.
Not really sure how to draw any. Well, the conference was successful in many ways because it would have seriously affected the economies of U.S., Japan, and Britain if they tried to build the G3s, N3s, the South Dakotas, and the full seat of KIs and KAGA classes. Going into these agreements, they could look back and say we didn't get everything we might have wanted. We didn't get a full disarmament. We didn't get agreements on destroyers and cruisers, but we saved a lot of money. And we saved a lot of time. We saved a lot of expense. So it's encouraging to know that you don't have to get absolutely everything right to make some advantage. You get some advantage of what you're trying to do. The French and Italians especially got locked into a back channel position, but that was where they were going to be. They weren't naval powers at the time, and weren't likely to be. So I'm not sure if that answers your Robert's question. But as a case in point, yes, get the powers together and decide where common ground is and where concessions can be made, and it was a case in point. Okay.
Okay, so I had one other question, and you sort of touched on this very briefly. But how did this impact non-signatories and the plans that they had? Was there anything other than the Germans basically saying they weren't interested?
Not really. Nobody else at that point was interested in trying to build a navy that was going to compete with the great powers. We had the 5 people in it that were likely to build any significant number of capital ships to these designs. I don't think anybody beyond those nations tried to build a battleship after that. Well, the Russians. But beyond that, I don't think anybody else tried to build a battleship after that. The Russians, I read about with the Russians, they felt they were kind of excluded from it. But then again, the Russians are a land power, and they weren't about to compete anyway. They kind of felt that, but they certainly felt snubbed that they weren't included in it. Now the Soviet Union, brand new Soviet Union, they're largely internally focused, and they weren't about to participate internationally in the first place. As far as where anybody else was, Turkey, Chile, various other countries had been operating battleships, but they weren't about to in the future. Australia, of course, was part of the Commonwealth, and they were building cruisers, and they had some battleships, battlecruisers, and were in the First World War. No, I guess they did, but they were largely built around a cruiser force. So nobody else was really that interested in ready to start building on that level. So we had the 5 nations involved in the conference that were serious competitors in the naval arms race. Okay.
So we don't have any more questions unless somebody wants to take the opportunity to toss something else in the chat. We'll give them a second to do that. And it looks like that's it. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate that you came and hope that this was useful for you. And we will catch you in the next lecture, we hope, which is going to start at 8. Thanks again. Bye for now.